Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our virtual town hall, Build Back, Dream Forward. Today we have an opportunity to come together for a thoughtful discussion and reflection on COVID-19, our community, and the chance for real change that it presents. Our community foundation and many other local institutions have been in pandemic response mode since mid-March. Our COVID-19 response fund for Northern Virginia ended up raising about $2.1 million, and from that we awarded about 110 rapid response grants to local nonprofits that helped fill a critical gap between the advent of the virus in mid-March and the launch of the government's response a few weeks later. And while we continue to respond to what the virus has caused, our thoughts also turn now to what the virus has revealed. Data from local health districts in Northern Virginia, for example, show that COVID-19 has had a very large and disproportionate health impact on people of color in the region. Take a look, for example, at the Fairfax Health District's COVID-19 dashboard, which just yesterday showed that our Latinx population, which constitutes about 16% of the county's total population, constitutes 62% of the COVID-19 cases in the county. And the economic impacts of the virus are also disproportionately large in communities of color. Latinx, Hispanic, and African American small business owners in particular have been hit very hard by the pandemic. And recent events surrounding the murder of George Floyd and other African Americans in police custody have brought into clear focus structural racism and systemic inequities that pre-existed COVID-19 and contributed to the disproportionate impacts of the virus in the first place. We need to have an important dialogue about the health, economic, and societal inequities that the pandemic has revealed. Some of the best solutions to big problems in this country have been fostered at the local level. So let's take a look at Northern Virginia. How do we build back better here? How do we build a resilient, more equitable community that truly works for everyone? Today we are honored to have a distinguished panel of thoughtful leaders to share some thoughts around these challenges and opportunities. We have Corey Holman, Chairman of the Northern Virginia Black Chamber of Commerce. We have Han Lee, Executive Director of the Weisberg Foundation. Preston Lynch, Associate Dean of University Life at George Mason University. And Michelle Zahor, Founder and Chairman of the Virginia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Their bios can be found in the program we previously sent you. And to moderate today's discussion and share some of her own thinking about COVID-19 and its impact on diverse entrepreneurs, it is my pleasure to introduce and welcome Nancy Santiago. Nancy has over 2 decades of experience in the areas of education, economic development, federal policy, and philanthropy. She currently leads community impact efforts at Eureka, an online platform that seeks to democratize economic opportunity for underrepresented entrepreneurs by providing them the community, the resources, and the tools they need to thrive. Recently, Nancy founded the Power Up Fund, a philanthropically sourced investment fund for Latin-led entrepreneurs housed at Hispanics in Philanthropy. Nancy, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you, Tara, for all of your hard work in pulling all this together. I'm really thrilled to be here today with such a distinguished panel of guests, and I'm actually really thankful to the Community Foundation Northern Virginia for allowing us to come together and have this discussion. I thought that before we start the panel, I'd go through just some framing kind of slides, a context, if you would, around where we are as a country, and quite honestly, where we were prior to COVID. Prior to COVID-19, we were already on track for probably the fastest growing racial wealth gap this country has seen in decades, where instead of shrinking the race-based wealth gap, it was expanding and growing at an enormous speed. Quite honestly, if we think about the number of entrepreneurs that were left out of the economic mainstream in terms of access to capital, we were not on a good path to begin with. So now what we're looking at is COVID having exacerbated the situation and accelerated the gap that exists between diverse entrepreneurs and the rest of the economic mainstream. And if you could move on to the next slide, I just wanted, again, framing the conversation first, we're talking about the growth of minority businesses over the last 10 years. We've accounted for more than 50% of the 2 million new businesses that were started in the U.S. It's creating over 4.7 million jobs on the regular. There are now more than 4 million minority-owned companies in the United States, with annual sales prior to COVID totaling $700 billion. And when you look at the consumer side of this, Latino and African American consumers together had a spending power of $3.9 trillion. However, with all of that, we can move to the next slide, we can take a look at some of the issues that the race-based wealth gap left us grappling with prior to COVID. We were looking at Black and Latino households losing their median household wealth, not gaining. So when we look at the African American community, our Black brothers and sisters, we're looking at a shrinking household wealth, and they were on track at that point prior to COVID to lose that household wealth by the year 2053. When we talk about the wage gap and we talk about the amount of dollars that households had access to, you start to understand a little bit more about the inequities that were showing up across systems, from school districts to housing to healthcare and everything in between. All of that showed its face, all those inequities during COVID. Next slide. Just a little bit more information about the comparative wealth loss across households. I wanted you to keep this in mind and to keep in mind the underbanked communities as we go forward in this, because it all plays into the conversation. Next slide. At the end of the day, we know that diverse entrepreneurs, particularly in the African American Latino communities, lack access to capital. Their loan rejection rates are higher, and on average, Black, Hispanic, and women founders, I think it's important to keep the gender piece in here as well, all begin their businesses with the equivalent of 50% of the capital that a white man has access to when he starts a business. So the inequity doesn't start as the business unfolds. It starts long before that business is ever opened. Next slide. Now talk about the impact of COVID on our businesses. So we've talked about the lack of access to capital. We've talked about some of the inequities that drive this race-based wealth gap, but then enter COVID. And what we're looking at is that on average, Black and Latino communities, their community businesses have fewer than 14 days cash buffer. And if you think about it, most of us have been in lockdown mode for close to 5 months now. So if there's only 14 days cash buffer, what does that tell you about the health and survival rates of Black and brown businesses? Next slide. So enter the Paycheck Protection Program. The goal was to have that Paycheck Protection Program provide, through a federal stimulus, the capital that businesses needed to continue to survive beyond the pandemic. The truth of the matter is, as I showed you in a previous slide, the underbanked communities, Black and brown communities, that number plays a significant role in the Paycheck Protection Program, because banks were only interested in working with those businesses that had a previously existing relationship. As much concern as we had about the Paycheck Protection Program, our fears were not unfounded. When, at the end of the day, we look at the numbers, we see that 90% of people of color or businesses of color were locked out of the PPP program. Those are some of the concerns that our panelists will address today, because it's not just about being able to survive the pandemic, but how do you grow and thrive after. And I will also say, next slide, as we get into the discussion, I want you to keep in mind that there are 4 types of businesses we've been seeing coming out of the pandemic. Those are, 1, the businesses that know they're not going to make it, and they're trying their best to mitigate losses and mitigate the impact of this on their families and their communities. Those businesses that know they will make it, or think they will, they're just not quite sure how deep the pain is going to go. So how do you plan when you're not quite sure what's happening in the near future. We have those that have lost jobs, that have decided to take what was once maybe a side gig and turn it into a business. There are many businesses that launched during recession. This time will be no different. So we see businesses coming online now for the first time. And then we have businesses that have actually seen growth during the pandemic. And for those of us in our communities, think about some of the businesses like cleaning businesses that now have new contracts to disinfect and prepare businesses and buildings that are taking care of hospitals and daycare centers. Let's talk about daycare centers. Round-the-clock daycare for essential workers has become a very real thing. We also have businesses like takeout food businesses that all of a sudden have seen a surge. How do we help those businesses maintain that growth? So with that context, and I'll show you one last slide, should you need any more information on resources that are available through the pandemic, please visit the Eureka site. It's eureka.biz. We welcome you on. We ask you to please join us. Next slide. If you need any information, you'll have a link to register, but please feel free to join us. Go to the COVID resources page. And as a small business owner, we are built to help you very specifically. We're a community of small business owners, coaches, mentors, and support to help you not only make it through the pandemic, but thrive on the other side of this. So that said, I want to get us into our conversation today and have our guests really walk you through what they've learned, what they're doing, and what they hope to see on the other side of this pandemic. So before we begin the moderated part of this discussion, I really wanted to remind you once again that all audience members are welcome to submit questions for the question and answer session through the text message on the phone number that's on your screen. So that number again is 703-828-4372. Please submit your questions, and we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to get started with the first question. And we want to start with how COVID has inequitably impacted communities of color in Northern Virginia. And to kick off that conversation, I believe we are starting with Corey, whose first face I saw come up on the screen. So I want to make sure that we start with Corey and we start to move down the line after Corey. But again, Corey, can you walk us through, from your perspective, how COVID has impacted communities of color in Northern Virginia?
Absolutely, Nancy. Can you hear me okay?
We got you. Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, perfect. So I think you, and actually I have a little bit of an echo. Hold on one second. Okay, so I think you summed it up very well. And when we think about the fact that any community that is already behind economically from the rest of the area or the rest of the country, anytime there's a downfall in the economy, then they are going to be more negatively impacted. And for the Black Chamber of Commerce, we especially focus on small and minority-owned businesses. And so I think you hit the nail on the head with a lot of what you already mentioned. The challenge is that if our businesses don't have access to capital, then how do you sustain during such a downturn? And especially the fact that 95% of all Black-owned businesses are sole proprietorships. And if you think about, to your point with PPP, it was more easily accessible for those folks who have a payroll. And so if you were just a small business, a small barbershop, or you're an electrician and you don't have any employees, then you're not only are you suffering, but you have less resources to help sustain throughout this pandemic. So with that, I'll hold there, and thank you for recognizing me, and thank you for hosting the panel.
No, thank you, Corey. And I wanted to switch over to Michelle, who's also on the line. Michelle Sanjur, same kind of question. The impact of this on the Latino community in Northern Virginia, what have you seen in what's happening with the businesses that are part of your chamber network?
Well, this has greatly impacted the Hispanic community. There's a saying that I've heard many times, when the U.S. economy catches a cold, the Hispanic community catches pneumonia. And this is a reality because so many of the challenges just before they even get started. Like was stated earlier, with 16% of the population in Northern Virginia and Fairfax, Fairfax having over 62% of the coronavirus cases, this impact is unproportioned to the population. The community with other people of color make up 40% of this essential industry that in the workforce today, like childcare, healthcare workers, food-related employees, cleaning staff. This community was essential and vital to keep the economy running during this time, so many of us could work from home. Latino business has also been disproportionately affected, like you have shared, Nancy, receiving the financial assistance that other businesses were able to obtain. And because of this, many businesses will not be able to survive this pandemic, even if they survive the virus itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And I also wanted to allow our partners, both in philanthropy and education, to also jump in here and talk a little bit about the inequitable impact that they've seen. So I'm going to start with philanthropy, and then I'm going to move it into education. So let's start with Han. Same question. What's been the kind of impact and the inequities of that impact that you've seen kind of from your purview in philanthropy?
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks for the Community Foundation of Northern Virginia for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. So I think it's been said explicitly and implicitly already by you and our panelists who've spoken that the pandemic has laid bare and deepened racial inequities that existed long before, the COVID-19 appeared in our region. And those are everything from educational inequities, racial inequities, kids who are now going or had to go through virtual schooling and the impact on that, and youth with limited tech access, or parents with less flexible jobs and ability to support them in the school. The economic impacts that you certainly talked about to entrepreneurs and business owners, and also those considered essential workers, right, but who are not being treated and compensated in ways that really value how essential their work and their health and their lives really are. And then clearly, this is a health pandemic, or it started, or what people think was a health pandemic, although it has impacts across all parts of our lives and community. But, higher rates of cases, obviously, among and impact on physical health of Latinx lives from the virus because of proximity, racial bias in our healthcare system, the compounding impacts of individual, collective, and generational trauma that Black and Brown people have always had to deal with, right? And then also the mental health. The Washington Post came out with findings recently that Black and Asian American populations are suffering from higher rates of stress and anxiety, especially more so now when, in particular, the anti-Black and anti-Asian sentiment is being fueled by many in power. So, the inequities, racial inequities, as I said, have been there, and now they've been deeply compounded.
Thank you, Han. I appreciate that. And it's interesting that you went around the education pieces, because that's a big concern for everyone, and it's right now one of the hot topics being discussed across the country is what will happen to our education system post-COVID. When does it reopen? And I'm hoping, Creston, you can help us talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the education space, and the higher education space, and maybe what you're concerned about for young people coming in through that pipeline into the higher education space.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to reiterate what Han said around the idea of the inequities that are being exacerbated at this point in the wake of this pandemic. The fact that our students do have challenges as it relates to access to technology, access to reliable internet, access to webcams, or not necessarily feeling comfortable being on webcams at home, and our professors or our instructors make character judgments or make value judgments in that, right? And so dealing with negative biases. But as you mentioned, I think some of the effects that we are going to have to prepare for as students, particularly first generation
lower income, and we all know the intersections between race and class here. We've been talking about the economic disparities when we're thinking about the preparation of our students. And so we've had students that have had to go home during their senior year in high school and had to finish their high school careers virtually, and then now are going to be asked to in many ways, start their college careers virtually. And we also know that students, particularly minority students, are more likely to be retained when they are academically and socially engaged into the campus community. And it really is a challenge to do that when students are being asked to learn virtually. And we know that when we're asking them to do that, of course, it's for their long-term health and safety, but at the same time, we're going to have to mitigate some of the challenges that they are going to incur with likely being not necessarily as prepared if they've had to finish their high school careers and online, and then having to work even harder to integrate them into the campus community so that they are academically and socially engaged and feel connected to our campus, so they'll be more likely to retain. So those are some of the things for which we are preparing, and some of the things that we're going to be working to mitigate at the higher education level.
Thank you, Creston. Thanks so much to everyone for giving us some context and some framing. And now I think that part of the conversation that I'm really looking forward to is this next piece to kind of untangle what it is that each of you are doing right now in this moment to build us back better, because I think everyone's pretty clear, at least from everything that we've heard, none of us on this panel want to build back to what was, because what was pretty inequitable. So what are we doing now to build back better? Give us an idea of what you're building towards and why you're building towards that. And I'm going to start with philanthropy, since this is a foundation that's pulling us together. I think it's really important to get kind of the bird's eye view from philanthropy on what it is that you're doing to build back better and what you're working towards. Han, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I'm happy to. And, you know, at the Weisberg Foundation, we started going down a path 4 or 5 years ago, kind of really led by the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers and their Putting Racism on the Table learning series, right? That set us on a path of really intentionally centering racial equity in our work based on the guidance of racial justice funders and community members who had been doing this work long before we joined in. So centering our values of equity and justice, listening and learning, building power and community, and especially supporting power building in people of color communities by people of color-led organizations that are working for systems change, you know, through year-round advocacy, organizing, and civic engagement to build power and change systems for racial justice and strengthen our democracy. So, you know, that's played out in our grant making as well as our non-grant making strategies, how we're thinking about our endowment, how we're thinking about using, you know, our social capital to move others. Internally, we continue to build our anti-racist understanding and analysis and operationalization through our governance, our operations, and programming. And then we just continue to spend more and more time with other funders we can mobilize and organize with to have a greater impact through collective action, well more than we could have ourselves as individual funders.
There we are. Thank you very much, Anna. I appreciate that. And I actually want to ask the same question, starting with Michelle and then moving to Corey. In the business community, what are you working on right now, and what are you building towards coming out of this? Can we start with Michelle?
Well, yes. Right now, what we have really done is to really inform the community of vital information that they need to know to get through this epidemic. So we have really lobbied to make sure that materials were in Spanish and to get it out. We've started an e-alert bulletin that we get out into the community to update the community of resources that they need to know to help their businesses and help the community. We also have really, just like many other businesses, have brought our business development center online, our legal and technical clinics. We do them virtually. We started doing our job fairs virtually too. And it is really important that we brought this virtual aspect that we have really not engaged much in to really assist the community during this time, so they're able to build their resources. And so, like this right now, the thing that we do that's really unique is we do it both in Spanish and English. We do it bilingual, so language and culture aren't a barrier. And this is important, and that we continue this work to move forward, because it makes a difference when you can reach this community that a lot of time is underserved with information and education, that we are able to help bring that to them.
And Preston, same question for you. Corey, same question for you, and then we'll move on to Preston. Corey?
Yes, excellent. Thank you. So there's three main things that we're focusing on in terms of our businesses, not only our members, but the business community. Number one, we want to save as many businesses as possible. And so that includes make sure that everyone understands how to get access to the resources that they need. Typically, it's going to be cash in the form of some loan, whether it's PPP or whether it's EIDL or for whatever's available. So anytime any of our member businesses want that information, of course, we want to be there to give them specific names of banks, or especially smaller community banks, that are willing to help them out. And then secondly, we're encouraging everyone to focus on their balance sheet. If we look at not only small companies, but the public companies, you'll notice that those that are filing for bankruptcy and those businesses that are not making it are the ones that don't have enough cash on hand. So we want everyone to learn from this. It's great to invest in your business, but you also have to store cash on hand for a rainy day, just as we need to do, in our personal bank accounts, right? You have to have savings. Well, in your business, you have to have enough operating cash to help get you through a situation such as this. And then the last thing would be, we're encouraging everyone to seize the moment. A lot of very successful companies are founded or experience tremendous growth during an economic downturn. So we want everyone to focus on figuring out how can you pivot to take advantage of the not necessarily the pandemic, but take advantage of the changes that are going on in our market. And so that's what we're focusing on right now.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Corey. And Preston, in the education space, what is it that you're building towards, given the fact that we don't know when this is virtual learning will end?
Yeah, I think that our mission and our vision is twofold. At one hand, we are completely and comprehensively dedicated to creating a diverse, equitable, and anti-racist learning environment for our students. And so our attention has always been and will continue to be on our campus climate, and we have to be able to do that whether or not we are face-to-face or virtually, because we know that is going to give our students the wherewithal in order to go out into the world to be responsible contributors to society. And so in that realm, we want to educate our students. We want to create a diverse and inclusive learning environment for our students. But we also know that in doing that, we are putting Mason graduates into the world that are able to contribute and, dismantle systems of oppression and racism as well. And so when we're thinking about Mason for the world, we're thinking about the environment that we're creating now that will in turn have significant impact on our future, and specifically in this Northern Virginia region.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much. And I'm conscious of time, so I want to make sure that the next few questions that we go through, I give an opportunity for folks to answer. If you have an answer, go for it, and if you don't, we can move on to the next question, because I want to give plenty of time for question and answer. So let's start with this question. What is it that the region of Northern Virginia is doing differently that you feel needs to be highlighted as a promising practice? Anyone on the panel, feel free to take that one on. Do we have any takers on that one? What is it that Northern Virginia is doing differently that should be highlighted as a promising practice for the rest of the country?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yes,
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Han. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So I'll talk quickly about philanthropy. So I think more and more, and certainly more than 5 years ago and 10 years ago, we see philanthropy naming race and racism instead of just talking around it, right, or talking about other things like socioeconomics or gender, but naming race and racism. More funders are being intentional and explicit and public about supporting people of color-led organizations generally, and specifically those that are doing systems change work for racial equity. You know, I point to the Community Foundation of Northern Virginia's round 5 of your responsive grant funds, and which would flip to many of those organizations. And then what's super exciting is we see through this pandemic more funders leaning into trust-based philanthropy practices, right? Doing our homework instead of putting that burden on grantee partners, simplifying and streamlining paperwork, being transparent and responsive in terms of process, soliciting and acting on feedback from community, offering support beyond the check, and providing hopefully more multi-year unrestricted funding in particular. And so we see a lot of funders who've jumped into these trust-based practices because of the urgency of the crisis. And what we're hoping is that we as a sector, you know, continue to do that in a sustained way well beyond the crisis, you know, and work in ways that are grounded in equity and deeply power aware.
Great. Thank you. And I think, Corey, you were trying to jump in there?
Yes, I was going to say, and I'm sure that there's other counties across the country that may be doing the same thing. But here, I know that Prince William County, Fairfax, and other counties nearby are offering micro grants for small businesses. So we're encouraging everyone to look into that, reach out to your economic development authority in your county. They're not hard to get, and there's a lot of funds that are available. So please take advantage of that. Get your loan, well, in this case, this would be a grant, so it's free money. So take advantage of that to help your business get through this situation.
And I
so
just
micro grants, that's huge. Thank you, Michelle.
I just want to add also that one of wonderful examples, communities coming together and working together. And one example is the collaboration between the 3 chambers, the Northern Virginia Black Chamber, the Asian American Chamber of Commerce, and the Virginia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. We have all pulled together to share resources. Working together, we share so much in common, and yet it gives us the ability to work with our constituency, but at the same time share resources that we can better serve all the communities that we share so much in common with.
And I can jump in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, and I can jump in and talk about some of the things that we're doing at Mason, and that really has implications for Northern Virginia, because I think that our positionality in the backyard of the nation's capital and in Northern Virginia gives us opportunities to really have conversations and really to implement policies and procedures around and initiatives around anti-racism and equity. And so we have been in collaboration with the Association of American Colleges and Universities. We've been named the Campus Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, and we've done that through our ambition and our hopes of collaborating with community partners. And so if there's anyone in the room that's interested in joining this work with us, we're more than willing to invite people into that conversation. But we're doing that through the concepts of narrative change, racial healing, and relationship building, not only on campus, but also in our community. And so that involves, and through the lens of separation, law, and economy. And so how can we, law and policy and economy, excuse me. And so how can we analyze the policies and procedures that are not only on campus, but in our community that perpetuate a system of inequality and racial inequity? And how can we think about narrative change? How can we look at our history as in Northern Virginia and the National Capital Region and grapple with that and address that and name that? As higher education as an institution has been built on white supremacy in our curriculum, right, and the ways in which we have structured our organization. So how can we deconstruct that and, as Con said, name racism, intentionally implement anti-racist policies, and intentionally dismantle white supremacy? But also, how can we have meaningful educational conversations that prepare our students to continue to do that work? And so those are some things that we're really, really excited about. But we're also excited about partnering with our community partners in order to expand that work, not only on campus, but in the community.
Thank you very much, Preston. And I actually, on that vein, would like to ask folks a little bit about what they do in preparation for a second wave, because we're being told that there's a second wave coming. So you guys are already thinking in the educational space about what the ongoing long-term work is. But I'd like to ask other folks to jump in here. And again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of let folks jump in. What happens with this second wave? What preventative measures are you instituting to prepare for the future? What are we recommending for our area businesses to focus on? I know we're talking about things like mini grants and support from the chambers and this kind of collegial relationship that's being built amongst and the different communities in the different chambers. But what would you tell your members in preparation for a second wave? And I'm looking specifically to Corey and to Michelle. What are you telling folks about how to prepare for this next wave, should one happen, and what is it that businesses need to be focused on?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. But one of the things, like Corey said, is making sure that that they have access to capital. It really is a lot of businesses that don't have banking relationship, that we're able to connect them to grant opportunities, to assistance to help them get through this. Another thing is making sure that they're communicating with their customers and employees on safety measures and how to distinguish them to come out of this with innovative ways to better themselves. This is an opportunity that you can rebrand yourself, you can rebuild yourself to something that you weren't before. So I think a lot of that, and then too is to make sure that the businesses are using technology to the fullest. So we are working really closely to help businesses go online, helping them to make sure that they have the adequate resources to be found. And we're building the most comprehensive database of Latino businesses in Virginia and the greater Washington area that to better help these businesses be found.
Thank you. Corey?
So the main phrase I would say is to plan for the best, but prepare for the worst. Again, plan for the best, but prepare for the worst. We want our businesses to think in this way. What if things don't change? What if this is our new normal? How can you conduct business in this current climate and make money? And not only make money, but how can you thrive? And so now is the time to really go back and focus on your product or your service and see how you can keep your customers in this potentially new long-term way of doing business. And then, of course, keep your costs low as possible and save your money.
Yeah. And I'm going to take us, thank you, Corey. I'm going to take us to the last question, but start with our panelists who weren't able to answer that last question because I want to get us to the questions and answers. But I want to now end with, at least this part of the discussion, with the what's next. What is the most promising idea that you believe will actually help build a more equitable future for everyone who lives here? And again, I'm going to start with philanthropy, and then I'll shift to education, and then we'll wrap up with some thoughts from our business community. But what's next? What's the most promising idea that you're looking at, that you're actually working towards in philanthropy that you think will get us to a better future for all of us?
Sure, and I will not claim credit for this idea. This idea has been out there, but what I see is the most promising strategy, and it seems so simple, yet in practice it's so hard for us, I'll say us in philanthropy to do, right, is to just listen to and follow the lead of and co-conspire with Black, Indigenous, people of color movement leaders, right, who have been doing the work, who know what needs to happen. I think in recent months we've seen the continued senseless killing and terrorization of Black people, through state-sanctioned violence. We've seen, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities or reports about and data put out about the disparate impacts of COVID on Black and Brown communities, the dearth of Black and Brown representation on nonprofit boards and in senior leadership positions in nonprofits, and that, these organizations do not receive the same, just fractions, pennies to the dollar of the amount of funding that white-led organizations get. Like, we've seen these reports. And the truth is that Black, Indigenous, people of color leaders, movement leaders, they know this. We don't need another report, right? This is lived experience. This is lived expertise that's out there. They've been saying this, and we just need to listen. Think how best to build, wield, and share, and oftentimes cede power to be true, effective co-conspirators to build forward for justice.
Thank you, Han. And Preston, you're all about the future as an education institution. So what is the most promising thing you're looking at right now? And the truth and reconciliation work is critically important, but I'm sure there's a whole lot in there that you haven't gotten a chance to tell us about.
Absolutely. There's a lot in there. And I think that when you're dealing with an industry that is as large and complex as education, specifically higher education, sometimes I tell people that it's almost like trying to play soccer with 6 goals and 7 different teams with so many competing agendas. But what we have to do, what we have an opportunity now in the wake of this pandemic, but also in the wake of this movement and this moment that we're experiencing around specific anti-racism, right? It's what it's in a lot of ways revolutionary because everyone is paying attention, everybody's having conversations. And so at this one point, specifically in education, when we're thinking about anti-racism, we all have one goal, we all have one focus, and how can we continue to be intentionally not necessarily focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because a lot of times diversity, equity, and inclusion, anti-racism can get lost in that, right? And that's important, but at the same time, we have the opportunity to really closely examine our policies that promote inequity, whether or not it's our mission policy, whether or not it's our acceptance policy, whether or not it's our when we're thinking about diverse, inclusive communities for our faculty, what are our tenure promotion policies. These are all conversations that we're having. But we're also talking about how can we specifically name and adjust and address anti-racism as it relates to our student experience that, like I said earlier, not only will impact their experience now, but will also prepare them to address these issues as we move forward. And so what we're excited about now under the umbrella of this truth, racial healing, and transformation is the idea that there are a lot of people that are either enthusiastic or pressured to have these conversations and to make these changes. And we want to leverage that moment in this movement to move us farther along than we've ever been in the future. So that's really exciting for us.
Great. I thank you very much. And I am going to shift us to Eileen so we can get to some of the questions and answers. I think some of the information that came out of this discussion was incredibly rich, and I'm sure there are a whole lot of questions. I've been learning quite a bit about what's happening in Northern Virginia and trying to relay that information and apply it in other communities. So I'm excited to hear the questions that are coming up out of here. And I'm going to thank everyone again, thank our panelists for such an important discussion, and transition back to Eileen, who's going to lead us in the question and answer session.
Thank you, Nancy.
Okay.
I'm just going to remind everybody, if you've got a question, text it to 703-828-4372. Okay, so let's start with this question. And Nancy, definitely feel, at this point of the program that you can chime in with your thoughts as well. So we've talked a lot about access to capital and systems change around access to capital. Where would you place the importance of access to small business coaching and mentorship, as well as access to capital, and ways that our greater community can help small business owners of color get that as well as access to capital? So what are your thoughts about business coaching and mentoring versus capital?
Well, I think the most important thing for me is making sure philanthropy, the financial sector, everyone who's out there poised and ready to help understand that you cannot decouple financial resources from coaching and support. This is a situation that not many of us right now have lived through before. The ability to have many folks help you strategize and plan and almost see around the corner of what's coming is going to be critically important to the survival of businesses, particularly businesses that are starting at a disadvantage because we don't have the same access to resources. So very important not to decouple the access to financial resources from the technical assistance and support that is needed. Small businesses should feel like they can go to get help for just those kinds of concerns At Eureka, this is what we're doing every day. So every day we have not just members who are of our community that are mentors and coaches, but even peer small business owners that might have passed this hurdle already, helping other small businesses figure out how to cross those hurdles themselves. So there is a constant conversation about that. And it's a space and a place not only where you say, hey, I need help, and you raise your hand, but it is dedicated support for the long term. So matching people both for the needs they have at that moment to get through that difficult situation, but also matching them with the team that they need to get them to plan for the long term. And quite honestly, there's a whole nother piece of the work, and that is rewiring the brains of consumers to understand the importance of using our spending power to keep our small businesses and our communities, our community businesses alive and thriving. So the Eureka platform is made to help connect financial resources with strategic coaching and mentoring, and we are there, and we are free, and we are ready and willing to help. But then we are also there to help drive the conversation about how we deploy our own spending power as consumers to continue to uplift and build our community businesses. So anyone who hasn't joined, feel free. This is what we're here for. There's never been a moment in time quite like this, but we have an amazing community of folks that are just standing at the ready to help.
Great. And Corey, when you were speaking previously, you were talking about, encouraging your members to focus on the balance sheet, right, and focus on cash in the bank. What does your chamber, or I guess this could be a question for both Corey and Michelle, what are your chambers doing around helping your members get that kind of, coaching that can contribute to their success going forward?
So one of the things that we're doing is we do have events that we're doing online through Zoom where we're talking about banking, and we have banking specialists come and speak about, hey, here's how you can get some of the funding, and here's some of the resources that are available. And so once you have those resources, then we have mentors within our chamber that will help those businesses understand how to cut costs and how to keep your money as much as possible.
And likewise, we do events to educate the community, but we also have one-on-one counseling. We work with several businesses to help them to apply for the PPP loan and help them guide them through these resources that are available. And one thing that we do, too, that is we do it both in Spanish and English. We have to remember there's a large community that here that their first language is Spanish, and it to better assist them. If you can do it in the language, their first language, it really makes a big difference.
Okay, great. Okay, another question has come in about systems change around access to capital. That it seems like such a big thing to tackle, changing the entire system around access to capital. And the question reminded me of something I heard you say, Nancy, when I heard you speaking at a Bipartisan Policy Center webinar back in April around the level of loans that made it out to Latinx-owned businesses and African-American-owned businesses and women-owned businesses from, just for one example, the Small Business Administration, and how low those levels were. So the question really is about how do we begin to tackle such a big issue as systems change?
Well, I think truth is the number one thing we need to start with here, right? When we talked about the Paycheck Protection Program going through Small Business Administration, and those of us that know how broken the system is kind of gasp for air, because we know that the SBA itself had abysmal numbers when it came to lending to Black and brown entrepreneurs. So how was a system that already didn't do well in this space going to ensure equitable access for those minority business owners that have long been kept out of this system? So we have to start with calling it out. And I think I've been very tough on members of Congress to say SBA didn't have this problem just this year. this issue of inequitable access has been around as long as the organization's been around. So when are we going to tackle that? And that is an issue that has to be tackled both by those of us as advocates, but also at the congressional level. And we need to keep the pressure on, because all this did was show how poorly that system was run. And quite honestly, the first rounds of stimulus money, the numbers were something like approximately 3% of all of that money went to minority-owned businesses. Again, think about it. If the SBA's numbers are around 3%, and now the Paycheck Protection Program, at least the first round of it was at 3%, what's that telling you? That we're just redoing what we've always done. We didn't do anything differently. So I think this is a moment in time to think systemically and to challenge not just the organizations like SBA, but our financial sector. I mean, we have conversations that need to be had right now about what their changes are going to look like going forward. How are we using and thinking about the Community Reinvestment Act, which was for many years what drove banks to invest in communities and invest in communities of color specifically. What are we doing there? Instead of tearing that apart, what are we doing and how are we giving that Community Reinvestment Act more teeth to do what it's supposed to do, which is to create equity? How are we, philanthropy, education, and other institutions, now creating those pressure points for legislators, for the financial sector, and educating our taxpayers on how their dollars are being used? This is our moment in time to create what we want to see. We may not get this again. So I think we have to be very loud and very clear about the systemic problems, point them out, be honest about them, and start to dig into some of them. And we're not going to get to do this. This isn't going to happen in a few months. This is going to take a long time to undo this. And really, organizations like educational institutions and philanthropy that are taking hard looks at the policies that have created and continue to sustain this inequitable system. You guys are doing the hard work right now of pointing out what those policies are and how they need to be fixed, and I think we need to be paying attention to that and driving that narrative of systems change beyond our little networks.
Okay, do any of the other panelists have something to add to that question about tackling systems change? And I heard Nancy say, you know, and to Han's point, it starts with listening, it starts with awareness, it starts with conversation, and in my mind, all of that is really leading to one thing, right? A common understanding of the system that needs changing, a common understanding, you know?
And I did just think that to add one thing that I share a lot is that it's important for a community to realize that the train doesn't arrive until all the cars and even the caboose arrive to the train station. And I think that's what we have to think for of a community, that we need to work together to make sure that it is equitable for everyone. And I think it doesn't have to be that complicated. I know the assistance that we bring in other organizations make a big difference. And I think that assistance really sometimes just to get them through the initial steps makes a big difference in having a business be successful.
Yeah. Hey, Eileen, I'd like to comment on that really quickly. So in our calls with some of our U.S. senators, we've talked to Senator Kaine and Senator Warner about the fact that whenever there's a program that does not have a portion of those funds dedicated to minority businesses, we are going to be left out. And even once they came back and made some changes and said, hey, well, now we're going to dedicate a certain amount of funds for COVID-19 efforts to CDFIs, which are, you know, smaller community financial institutions, with the intention of them lending more funds to African Americans, there was never any true incentives for banks to make sure that small businesses and minority businesses were included. So if we do anything like that in the future, then we're going to be left out again. And so I certainly support also what Nancy and Michelle said. They're 100% correct. So we have to encourage our legislators to intentionally make sure that banks have to include minority-owned businesses and small businesses in any future programs to help.
So that's a very practical place to start. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think what you talked about the importance of education, and you talked about the importance of conversations. And I think that when we're thinking about system change, we have to be able to recognize not only where systems of inequality exist and persist, but then we also have to think about our agency and our participation into that system. Because when we're thinking about whether or not it's corporate America, even philanthropy, and certainly education, by being employees or people in that or proponents of that industry, we still have a place in that system, and then we have to grapple with the ways in which we may contribute to that system unintentionally, right? And then challenge other people to do that as well. I had a really interesting conversation with a colleague about how do we decolonize our higher education as it relates to the curriculum, as it relates to our structures. And going back to Corey's point, when we're thinking about our curriculum and we're thinking about the things that we ask our students, whether or not it's post-secondary or secondary education or even elementary education, when we have a curriculum that doesn't have a diverse set of authors or contributors to readings and theories and practices, then we are then leaving students out and sending messages to those students, right? And so how do we grapple with that, and then how do we take intentional measures to, if we're going to dismantle the system, how do we do that without tearing the entire system down, right? How do we grapple with the way that this system is set up and how we can make significant changes to it without, and whether or not we do need to tear it down and build something new?
So we have just 2 minutes left, and I'm going to ask a big question and, get everybody's last minute input here. But I think we all agree, if we stay in our silos here, right, just look at this panel. We've got representatives from philanthropy. We have representatives from business. We have representatives from higher ed, right? If we stay in our silos, it's just not going to have the same impact overall. So how do we come together in a meaningful way to work towards this goal of systems change? And with that, I'll just throw it out to the panelists, and what are your final thoughts on that? What do we need to do? What can we all do together that'll make a difference, a bigger difference than if we were just staying in our silos and acting alone?
For me, Eileen, it's educating each other, right? We're educating each other about what's happening in our respective worlds so that we can help each other maneuver forward, to Han's point of listening. I mean, pay attention to what's happening right now, where the protections we had put on for consumers against payday lenders are now being rolled back. People are in desperate situations right now. They're desperate for cash and access to keep their businesses afloat, and now we're going to allow payday lenders to take full advantage of our communities of color. Those are the kind of things we need to be sharing and flagging for one another so that we can figure out workarounds and we figure out how we move forward. But sharing these moments of kind of sharing across sectors and across industries, really important. So thank you.
And just to add to that, I think that's really important that we learn from each other. One of the things that we're doing is we host every year our biggest fundraiser is a K-Pasa Festival. It got canceled this year, but we're taking it virtually, and we're making it a month long so people can experience during Hispanic Heritage Month, bringing culture, food, entertainment, language, but giving an opportunity for all communities to immerse in this community, to learn more about it. And I really think that as much more that we can learn about other communities, we don't see how different we are, but we see how much alike we are.
Beautiful. And Han, I'm going to let you have the final word here.
Oh, excellent. Well, I will say the good news is that a lot of this work is well underway by those already on this, in this conversation. And there's been for well over a year a group of cross-sector leaders working together to build a shared affirmative vision of a more inclusive region, right? And then working towards transformative solutions that impact multiple systems. And that's, it started as the future of racism and the Greater Washington region. And it includes members from the Washington Regional Association of Grant Makers as partners, Leadership Greater Washington, the Council on Governments, United Way, Center for Nonprofit Advancement. So all of these, these cross-sector organizations and constituencies working together for a shared affirmative vision. And I think that's really important that we continue to work together in that way across sectors and across the entire region.
And I will throw in my last theme here is that the philanthropic sector and the private sector and the government sector really can do a lot more to work together. I think we tend to stay in our silos, and in our silos we're very like-minded. It's only when we reach across those silos and hear other points of view that we grow and learn and figure out a path forward. So on that final note, I just want to thank you all for participating today in this conversation. We are sincerely grateful for your contributions. And thank all of the attendees who joined. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Thank you, Nancy, for moderating our discussion this morning. Corey, Han, Creston, Michelle, for sharing your insights with us today. So all I can say is stay tuned for ways our community can work together to build back better here, both during COVID-19 and beyond, and work to get us all through this very challenging time. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you.